Um, my name is JP LaCour, and I am one of the founding partners of a firm called BrandFoundations, as Christina mentioned. And we really help companies to maximize the value of their greatest intangible assets, their brand and culture. And we'll talk about that a little bit today. I'm also a certified partner at a firm called Culture Talk, which is an instrument we're going to be talking about. And I'm also board chair of Conscious Capitalism in New York City, which is a movement started by John Mackey, the founder of Whole Foods, and has chapters around the world, and aligns well with the work that we do at BrandFoundations in terms of creating good, healthy cultures in companies. So today's agenda, we're going to be talking about intangible assets, and we're going to look at how we tell a story about them. But we want to start by a little bit better understanding what they are and the impact that they have, specifically the financial impact they can have on an organization. Talk a little bit about the threats to those intangible assets in today's marketplace, and how we can protect and nurture them because they are worth so much to the enterprise value. And then ultimately, how do we tell a better story about it? Because we are brand guys, and this is the marketing channel, so we want to equip you guys to tell a better story about those intangible assets. So we'll start with taking a look at what they are and their financial impact. When financial folks look at intangible assets, they think about things like intellectual property and reputation and goodwill. Brand and culture are part of that. Those are the ones we're going to focus on today. And in particular, your brand, understanding the differences between some of these things. Your brand is really that DNA that defines the organization and your purpose and what you stand for. And it's messaging that goes, it's not about your products and your services. It has to be bigger than that. And it often boils down to one theme or idea. And your culture is going to be the way you go about delivering on that. It's going to be the unique way you do things. And ultimately, it's the one differentiator that no other company will have. It's the thing that makes you truly unique. And so if you take one example of a brand, FedEx, and you look at these two attributes, FedEx's brand would be summed up in one word of dependability, right? That it's when things absolutely positively have to be there overnight, that's who you go to, right? That was the idea behind the company when it was started. And their culture would be wrapped up in this sort of that Purple Promise Award, that whatever it takes attitude that they give out to one employee every year who goes above and beyond to deliver on that promise of dependability. And so that just gives you an idea of how brand and culture kind of come together in great companies like FedEx. Now, in terms of understanding the valuation, some interesting data here. Ocean Tomo published a report a couple years ago that showed that the entire value of the S&P has essentially flipped from being 17% intangible assets and 83% tangible assets to almost the reverse of that. 87% in 2015 of the entire value of the S&P was in intangible assets. So it's a huge amount of value that is resides today in companies in these intangible assets of things like intellectual property, but also goodwill, which is brand and culture. And actually, KPMG has a study that shows across 14 different industries, I have a selective number of them here, that shows that on average, when a company is purchased, 50% of the purchase price goes to goodwill on average. And for some industries like internet and e-commerce, it's even more. But on average, half of what a company is sold for is going to be going to goodwill. That's not even intellectual property, just goodwill, which is effectively your brand and culture. And one other data point that I think is interesting to drive home the power of this, and help you make the case as marketers to your CEOs that you need to invest in this stuff, is a study called Significant Objects. It's actually a book out. There's 2 editions of it. But it started as a test, as a study that 2 writers did who wanted to test the impact that a good story could have on the most mundane possible products. So they literally went out to bought like at garage sales 100 different items and put them up on eBay to test what they would be sold for. And they were like salt and pepper shakers and combs and mirrors and a bunch of miscellaneous things. On average, they were got bids of $1.25, and they took them down and they hired professional writers to go out and write a story about each one. And they didn't go crazy. They didn't say it was Mrs. Lincoln's comb or anything, but just a little bit of a backstory to each object, and reposted them, and they sold for an average of $36. Which is another just an interesting, fascinating way to look at the power of an intangible story around what this product was to drive the price. So we know it has intangibles have a huge price on the value impact on the valuation of a company and what you can charge in the market and the price. And then finally, there's tons of data out there from Deloitte, E&Y, others who have looked at it and show that companies that have a really strong alignment of their brand and their culture and have a deep sense of purpose outperform all of their peers in terms of engagement, in terms of growth, revenues, et cetera. There's tons of data out there to support it. So what we know today is that these intangible assets are worth a tremendous amount to the company and can drive higher levels of performance. They can drive pricing. So we need to pay attention to them. And they've also never been more at risk. And so in fast-growing companies where there's a lot of M&A in the tech space happening, the number one risk to those intangibles is M&A. Most mergers and acquisitions fail to add shareholder value, and a lot of them detract from it. The biggest problem with this is that executives know that, and yet there's a lot of pressure to do deals and to merge and to grow through acquisition. And so they tend to ignore it, and they wish they had more data and more insight into the challenges. But we know that when we go through mergers, it creates a lot of distraction. Culture change is not easy. It creates a lot of morale problems, and it creates an opportunity for competitors to take advantage of it. So M&A is a huge risk to those intangibles that we're all going to run across at some point in our careers. Another one could be just some kind of an organizational crisis that takes place, and we've seen this at big brands like Wells Fargo. Lost its CEO and had billions of dollars in costs when part of the culture there sort of went rogue. And Uber, similar thing. Its intangibles around its culture and the cult of personality around its CEO led to a lot of backlash. So an organizational crisis, in addition to M&A, can cause a huge impact in the value of your intangibles. Could also come just from outside the organization. Societal crisis. The president could tweet about your company, and you'll have to respond in some fashion to protect those intangible assets, like Harley Davidson did when President Trump challenged their decision to move some production offshore. But they were very clear on what they stood for and what their purpose was. They were very clear on what they're about, and so they knew how to respond to that, which is to say that we exist to help people have freedom of the road, and if tariffs are imposed and that cuts off part of our market overseas, then we'll have to move production over there. So it gives them a leg to stand on. Similarly, Starbucks, when those patrons were thrown out of the Philadelphia location for not purchasing, they happened to be African Americans, and they hadn't bought anything. That became a big social media backlash as well. And but they also knew how to handle it because Starbucks knew that what it stood for and what it's all about is creating a third place. That's what its brand is all about. It's not work, it's not home, it's that third place you go to. That's always been what they were about. It wasn't about the coffee. And so knowing that and being really clear on that purpose allowed them to take a stand on that issue and close down all of their stores and retrain people. And again, these crises can come from inside or from outside. They can also come from inside. When we saw Microsoft, Deloitte, and even Google have employees decide that they were going to go on strike or walk out or protest because they didn't want their companies working for immigration and customs enforcement. And so again, lots of different places challenges can come to these intangibles, and we have to protect them. We have to do everything we can to tell the best story about them and nurture them and protect them. So that's the next part of this conversation. So we know intangible assets are worth more than they've ever been worth before. We know there's a tremendous number of risks that we can't control to them. So we got to make sure that they're resilient. The first way to do that is to make sure that at the heart of our brand and culture is a really strong sense of purpose. And to do that, or to illustrate that, we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you remember back to like high school psychology, I'm going to bring up high school psychology a couple times. Maslow is going to be one of them. Carl Jung is another one we're going to talk about in a minute. But Maslow theorized that there was sort of a hierarchy of people's needs. And when you really think about it, at the very bottom of that hierarchy are the things that just basically people, they're sort of plain vanilla. Like I'll come to work on time because I need to have food, shelter, I need income, I need to have safety, that kind of a thing. When you really want to get people motivated, you start to move up that pyramid. And so people will work later or work harder or give more of themselves because they want that promotion. Money becomes a big driver. But ultimately, if you want the maximum commitment from your people, you want the maximum cultural buy-in and alignment with your culture, it's going to come not from money. There's a diminishing return on what you get out of people when you pay them. But what will create that extra effort to work weekends, to make huge sacrifice, comes when there's a sense of purpose. And so that's one of the things we look at, is we have to have a really strong sense of purpose. We have to articulate it. We have to be clear on it. It has to be authentic. That will get people in the organization to do more than just show up for work or to work a little harder for that promotion or for themselves. if they're going to really put it all in there and do it for the good of the company, it's going to come from something deeper and more meaningful. Another best practice is to think about this messaging around your intangibles in terms of very fundamental human values. Jim Stengel, who wrote the book Grow and was the former chief, the global marketing officer at P&G, wrote in his book about this sort of, he practices P&G, there were sort of 5 fundamental values. There's probably more than that, depending on who you ask, but he kind of gravitated towards 5 that he thought every brand and culture could be grounded in. One of them was this idea of enabling connection. And Starbucks certainly does that with this idea of creating that third place where you go to meet and connect with people. It wasn't about the coffee or the music or anything else you'd buy there. It was about that sense of connection you were creating. At the other end of the spectrum might be something like eliciting joy. And Zappos does this really well. That's been the heart of their mantras, that they exist to create joy, to create happiness. And they have embedded that so deeply in the culture that they teach other companies how to do that, how to build culture around that. There's a great story of Tony Hsieh, the founder, early in the company's existence, was in Las Vegas for an evening with some friends before they'd moved their headquarters there. And one of his friend buddies was joking with him about the idea of delivering happiness. And he said, it'd make me really happy to have a pizza right now if I called the Zappos 1-800 number. Would they actually deliver it for me? And he said, go find out. And so the guy called the number and got on the phone with one of their people who answers there in their call center. And he said, I'm in Vegas and I'm in this hotel and I'd love a pizza, it would make me happy. And the guy said, we sell shoes. And his friend said, yeah, I understand, but don't you deliver happiness? Isn't that what you're all about? So the guy said, all right, what hotel are you in? What do you want on the pizza? And he literally ordered it. And I think that gives you an idea of how when you find that higher purpose, when you really build it into the organization, people will go above and beyond. And when you push authority down on other things, they'll go above and beyond to do things that would not happen in other organizations. So definitely need to focus on those fundamental human values. The other thing you need to do is think about the character of the people and the culture and your audience in terms of messaging and telling a story about your intangibles. So as an example, I use Apple and Microsoft. Here are 2 brands that people will literally tattoo themselves with, but they couldn't come from more different sort of origin stories. Apple, Steve Jobs founded the company to challenge convention, to challenge the status quo, to be a little bit edgy, to be a little bit exclusive and a little bit you're not as good as me kind of a thing. That's sort of the attitude of people who gravitated towards Apple. They were the crazy ones. They were the idealistic ones. That was the motto behind their advertising: think different, right? To not be like everyone else, to be a little bit better. There's a little bit of an elitist attitude there. Whereas Microsoft, Bill Gates' vision was completely different. It was to put a computer on every desktop. And it doesn't get any more democratic or every person than that. And it's not that one was necessarily right or one was wrong. It's really that both work, and it depends on what the audience sees in themselves. If you were an artist, if you were considered yourself one of the crazy ones, you probably gravitated towards Apple. If you were a guy who worked in IT and you weren't necessarily better than everybody else, or you just drove a Ford truck, rolled up your sleeves, and liked to do things the right way, then you probably gravitated towards Microsoft. And but it all starts with understanding the audience and understanding the character. And so the question becomes, how do you do that? How do you understand the character of your culture? How do you build that into your messaging? And so we use a framework called Archetypes. And again, going back to high school psychology, Carl Jung theorized at the turn of the century that there existed deeply within each of us. He was a psychologist, and he recognized that within each of us were these characters that he theorized, these archetypes, he called them, that we recognize all of them, and they are all elements of all of them are within us from tens of thousands of years of storytelling. And so we recognize the ruler or the jester or the hero or the caregiver, that these are stories and they all have a narrative element that we relate to. And so the question becomes, how do you find these? Once you know them, you can manage the culture, you can message it, you can create a storyline that ties everybody together. But you have to be able to measure it, and that's been a hard thing to do in history. The first firm to do it was a company called Culture Talk that we're a certified partner of, and they basically provide an instrument, a survey you give to everybody in the company, and it will come back and measure the dominant archetypes that you see in your organization. And then combined with some interviews and workshops and some other validation we do, we can really quickly see what are the dominant archetypes in the organization and why do they show up, how do they show up, and how do we create a message or a storyline that ties them all together. So for instance, heroes and caregivers share some attributes. We see them a lot in technology companies. And the attributes that they share are people will go above and beyond to accomplish things. They will really work themselves to the bone. That's a positive attribute. On the downside, they'll also burn out. And the way you handle them is very different. Heroes have to win. They have to slay a dragon. They have to win an award. They have to vanquish an enemy. There has to be victory. When they're not fulfilled, that has to be part of their story. Caregivers just need to be thanked and acknowledged. And so understanding the archetypes and what you're dealing with in your culture is the first step towards being able to actually create a storyline and a messaging framework that will resonate with everybody in the company and that will be authentic, especially as outsiders hear your story and then they interact with your people. So this is a very powerful tool. There are a number of different instruments that they use. There's organization-wide instruments that we use. There are also individual tools for measuring personal archetypes of people, for hiring, for team building, all sorts of great tools that you can leverage in that culture talk framework. And the last thing is you want to frame this in a story. You want to take these intangibles and you want to put them in a story as opposed to just facts. And storytelling is all the rage, and there's a reason for it, right? Our brains are wired for it. We're genetically predisposed to remember stories better than we are facts. There are various studies that show when you watch people's brains under an MRI, listening to facts versus a story, stories tend to light up a greater number of pathways, neural pathways in the brain. They also leave chemical traces that aid in recall, so people are more likely to retell a story. And ultimately, we connect with them. That's the most important thing at a deeper emotional level that drives decision making, whether I'm going to hire somebody, whether I'm going to buy from them, whether I'm going to go to work for that company. All those deep decisions are made at a deeper, more emotional level, and that's what stories get at. So as an example, here's a narrative that we all recognize, right? A small group of powerful interests have aligned to rig the system and perpetuate power at the expense of ordinary people. That's a storyline that we can recognize, and it's what's fascinating about it is that, going back to the archetypes, whether you were an every person or somebody who supported Bernie in the last election, or wanted to protest Wall Street and those are the bad guys, or you were a Tea Party patriot at opposite ends of the political spectrum, that story resonates with you. And I think that just helps to demonstrate that storytelling is the thing that is the way we can find some connection between people of greatly different perspectives and interests. We often will find a common story that we share. And then the last part I'm going to take you guys through is just a sort of framework for telling the story of these intangibles. And to do that, I'll actually share a story with you guys myself. So about 2 years ago, my partner and I were setting out to figure out how to do a little bit better content marketing ourselves, since we're a small two-man consulting shop. And part of that agenda was to do some regular blog posts. And it fell to my responsibility to, every 2 weeks, sit down and write something. And so one Saturday morning, as I dropped my high school age daughter off at a volunteer thing, I had a couple hours to kill. I sat down in a coffee shop and I decided I was going to write about, we had an editorial calendar and the topic was mission, vision, and values, which has traditionally been sort of the framework that people use to communicate some of these intangibles. And I sat down to write about it. And the first thing I did was I thought to myself, what's the difference between mission and vision again? Like most people, we kind of confuse them. And when I Googled it, this is what I found, which was about 100 million different entries in Google related to how to write a mission statement or a vision statement, or what the differences between them were, best practices, etc. Basically, there was no agreement on what it is. Everybody sort of has their own definition. And so that was the first point at which I thought this is a problem. We probably need a better model here than this. Next thing I did is I started to look at great brands that I respected, like FedEx, which I shared earlier in the presentation. And FedEx has this incredibly rich heritage and culture and story and brand, and this is their mission statement. And it doesn't at all capture some of those things, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes when I come back to it. But this is typical of what you would see out there in a mission statement. I also started to poke around and find mission statement generators, one of them by Dilbert. There were others out there, some of them obviously jokes, some of them look like they could have been quite serious. But that was another sign that this sort of whole framework, I think, has been abused. Mission, vision, values, and needed an update, and is not a good way to tell the story. And I also looked at things like core values, and what I saw is every organization has integrity as a core value. And to me, that's table stakes. We're in business. Business is predicated on the idea that there's going to be a fair transaction of goods and services for money. If you have to tell me that you're not going to cheat me, and that's one of your core values, that's sort of implied, right? I would expect most businesses could go deeper and find things that are more meaningful than just saying we're going to practice with integrity or honesty. Something like 95% of the Fortune 500 have integrity or honesty as a core value. So it's kind of become a joke. And so at the end of that, I basically said to myself, I'm not going to write another blog post or article about mission, vision, and values. I'm going to tear the whole thing down and declare it dead. And that's effectively what we did. We wrote an article that said we believe mission, vision, values were dead, and put it up on LinkedIn, and it went viral. It's been read, shared, liked, close to 100,000 times at this point. And so what I'm going to take you through is why we think that's the case and what we replaced it with, which is part of the reason we think it went viral. So the first thing we did is we looked at why we thought it wasn't effective. And there were a couple of reasons. One, mission, vision, values showed up for the first time in the 1960s in business school curriculums. And it perfectly captured the imagination of a post-World War II generation that had just defeated the Nazis, defeated the Axis powers, they accomplished the mission, sort of man in the gray flannel suit now, commuting into New York. It was the height of the 50s and the 60s. That was the attitude, and that was sort of the mentality. That was the culture then. And so that idea of a mission and vision and values resonated with them. But it doesn't really reflect today's millennial generation and Gen Y workforce, which are increasingly, will soon be 80% of the workforce. And they're much more purpose-driven, and they're much more concerned about having an impact in the world than they are and just about making money. So there's this sense of it being an old, generationally irrelevant in today's marketplace. I also think it's just been abused over the years, and so it's outdated. It's got a confusing construct. Nobody knows what the difference is between a mission statement and a vision statement, and often people don't know how the values relate to it. You can't tell a story around it. It doesn't give you an easy framework to remember or tell a story. It's not well used and differentiated, right? If everybody's got integrity as a core value, you're not hitting on something that's unique. And so for all those reasons, it doesn't get used effectively. People put it out there, it inspires eye rolling. Maybe it ends up on the wall somewhere. That's not to say no one does it well. There are companies who create good mission, vision statements and have really well articulated values, but for the vast majority of organizations, it becomes kind of a joke. And just the idea of calling it mission, vision, values, I think tends to inspire a lot of eye rolling. So on the basis of that, we propose something different, and we call it purpose, way, and impact. The first thing you'll notice is that we structured it around sort of 3 stages of a rocket. And the reason was that gives it some context, so that these are such important statements. At the end of the day, we believe everybody needs to know what they are, feel connected to them, and know how to use them. Whether it's a sales rep, customer service, even family members should know what that is of their parents. My dad was a GE guy, kind of grew up revering GE as an organization. And bragging about it, right, to my friends and their father, and so everybody needs to feel that connection to it and know how to use it. So you need context, you need to be able to tell a story. So having 3 stages of a rocket allows you to do that. And in our model, and we'll break down each of these purposes, roughly akin to kind of your mission statement. It's the reason the company got started. The second stage is going to be the way statement. It's going to be sort of what propels you into orbit, gets you, once you're off the ground, gets you through stages of growth and different chasms of growth. And then the impact is going to be ultimately, if you achieve your purpose, what it means. But we'll break down each of these for a little bit better understanding. But this gives it the context and the goal is to focus on 1 or 2 things that are going to really differentiate you and that are going to be memorable. So we'll start with purpose. In our model, purpose is the reason the company was started, and it's very much rooted in change. What was wrong with the world that we could not stand anymore and had to change? Almost every company has an origin story that's rooted in somebody seeing a problem or seeing something that was wrong that they wanted to change, and that was the reason they started the company. They simply couldn't accept that anymore. It tends to be something that's very inspirational, it fires people up. And it's that first stage because it gets the thing off the ground, um, and gets the venture started. So that's kind of the idea behind the purpose statement. What's wrong in your industry or what's wrong in your space that you won't accept and that you want to change. Figuring that out first and getting the message around that is that purpose statement. The next statement is going to be your way statement. And that's going to be, you may have a number of core values. In the original blog post that we did, we used Southwest Airlines as an example, and their purpose was to democratize air travel. You couldn't in the 1970s, not everybody could fly. It was very expensive, and so that was the goal. And that's their motto today, right? You're free to fly about the country. It's a very democratic sort of approach to it. The way they go about doing that, the thing that defines Southwest Airlines, they're an airline, so they have a lot of core values. I guarantee you safety is one of them, but that doesn't define them. What defines them is two things, one very human thing and one very mechanical sort of business model thing. The business model thing is low cost. We're going to keep costs down, like Walmart, right? That we're going to be the low cost provider of air travel so that it's accessible. That supports our purpose. The more human thing is that in order to do that, we're not going to give you a bunch of peanuts and perks and other stuff. We're going to use humor. We're going to celebrate humor and be fun and make that the way you get through the hassle of travel. And so that is an example of a way statement, right? Something functional, something human, but it's going to be just the one or two characteristics that are going to define you in the marketplace, not all your core values. And it's going to guide the organization over time in terms of how it's going to get into orbit. There's going to be periods of growth up and down. How are you going to handle layoffs? How are you going to handle behaviors? Who are you going to hire? What sorts of deals are you going to do, right? Do they fit? Does that company that we're going to merge with, do they celebrate our way? Do they operate the way we do? Are they our kind of people? You see this in sports teams. They're always looking for the guy that has, the Yankees way, or the, Red Sox, ethos, right? That's kind of about finding your way statement. So it's going to be that second stage, a simple statement, and I'll show you some examples. And then the third is going to be your impact statement. That is ultimately when you get into orbit, instead of a vision statement, which tends to be about everybody else in the company, or everybody else, or about the company itself, right? We intend to be the best company at, whatever, and nobody else really cares. An impact statement is going to be about everybody else in the world. If we've gotten into orbit and we have achieved our purpose and we look down at the rest of the world, how has it changed their lives? How has it made their lives better? That's the idea behind an impact statement. And so it's really the ultimate purpose of, or the ultimate outcome of achieving your purpose. It's probably going to be a little bit lofty. It's probably going to be a little bit of a stretch. But ultimately, that's the thing that's going to keep people motivated. So that's sort of the three statements in the PWI model. And then just to kind of bring it back to FedEx, since I trashed them before, this is what we came up with as an example. They didn't hire us to do this. We just used it as an example. But if you think about back to FedEx's purpose, or founding origin story, back in the 70s, you couldn't guarantee overnight shipping of packages because most of the airlines were built to move people around. And so Frederick Smith started the company with that in mind, and that the purpose was really to basically, in our belief, give any person or organization in the world the confidence and the ability to conduct a physical transaction as quickly as possible, effectively overnight. That was the reason they started the company. You couldn't do that before. So that was the thing that was wrong with it that they wanted to change. The way they go about doing that is by combining all of the advanced transportation logistics stuff, right? This is the functional business model stuff that everybody wants to talk about, but combined with something more human, which is, in FedEx's case, this whatever it takes attitude, that you will do whatever it takes to deliver on that promise, combined with all this modern logistics. Those are the two things that define FedEx. And that has become folklore in this country. If everybody has seen the movie Castaway, you remember at the end, Tom Hanks delivers the package after 10 years on an island. Like, that's how impactful this has become. And that idea, that ethos, and this Purple Promise Award that they give out to the one employee who goes above and beyond, has had such an impact that it ended up in that movie and was nowhere to be seen in that mission statement that I put up on the screen earlier. So that gives you an idea of how you can get back to the basics with a model like this. And then ultimately, for FedEx, their impact statement might be something like this: that when every organization and individual can conduct global commerce, the world shrinks and everyone can prosper. Something big, something lofty, something visionary, but it's about everybody else. It's not about the company itself. So that's a quick look at what we call the PWI model and the sort of the best practices, the thoughts we have around how do you communicate the value of your intangibles. and a couple of the tools like Culture Talk and PWI. And we want to make that available to you guys. We also, as an Insight Venture Partners partner, we do give a 15% discount on our work around brand and culture, PWI workshops, all of these things, if you're an Insight portfolio company. And with that, I'll pause and kind of turn it over to take some questions.